My name's John Lamb. I'm with the University of Minnesota, Department of Soil, Water and Climate. So our objective today is to demonstrate how to take a good soil sample or a representative soil sample for a nutrient recommendation. Now, why is that important to get a good soil sample? Most of the lab analyses are very, very accurate. So the biggest variable in the whole operation is how good that sample is. So that's what we're going to concentrate on. So what nutrients am I interested in soil sampling for? Now that depends on your pasture a little. If you're establishing your pasture, brand new, we want to make sure that we get the right pH. We want to get the immobile nutrients for phosphorus and potassium. And then one other thing, it depends on what your pasture is going to have in it, whether you put some nitrogen on or not. So for a new pasture, we're going to take a 0 to 6 inch sample. We're going to do it before you seed, and we're going to put the immobile nutrients and the lime on before your last tillage, so we get it worked in really well. Now, if we're in an established pasture, we're going to be doing the same thing, except we just broadcast those nutrients on the top. Now, for phosphorus and potassium and lime, we have soil tests that help us predict how much to put on. Now, if we're growing a pasture that's just a grass pasture, we particularly have to know what we're going to put on for nitrogen. We do not use a soil test per se for nitrogen recommendations on grasses. If you have legumes in your pasture, you may even want to back off a little bit more on the nitrogen and be careful about that. But that is all in the bulletin. The nitrogen basically comes from a table value and not from a soil test. How do we do this? It's not as easy as one would think. You have to plan a little bit beforehand. The first thing you need is to get the equipment together. One piece of equipment is called a soil probe. Soil probes tend to be round. They tend to go into the soil fairly easy. They can be very expensive though. They can cost between $50 and $100. So what do you do if you don't have a soil probe? You can use a common shovel to take a sample. Not as easy to use, but it can be done. What other things do you need then? Helps to have a bucket to put the cores into. The bucket should not be a galvanized bucket, metal bucket, because galvanization has zinc in it and it can foul up your analysis. Then you also need to get bags to put the sample in after you've taken it. These bags are from the University of Minnesota Soil Testing Laboratory, and we'll use those in a little bit here. And finally, when you've gone to the lab to get to the bags, you will get a sheet in which to check the samples in. And you will, on that sheet, you will tell them the history of the field. You will tell them where you're at. You'll give an identification number to it, and you'll tell them, okay, what crop do I want this recommendation for? Okay? And one last thing, if you're in a situation where it comes to sampling and you're using a probe and the soil is sticky, sometimes you need a lubricant, and there's several that can be used. One of them I've got here is a silicone spray, fairly inert, won't add to the analysis. We tend to use in a lot of our nutrient management things WD-40. Again, there isn't enough in it to affect the analysis in the soil sample. When it's dry, not as much needed, but that's one of the tricks of the trade. Now we need to kind of decide, where do we need to take the sample? It'll depend on the size of your pasture that you're working with. We're in a little smaller docket type of thing here, so it may not be very many samples at all. But if you're in a large pasture, we usually say do not take a sample that would represent more than 20 acres. We want to get these samples from soils that are very similar. And so if you have a situation where you have different landscape positions, say you're on the upland like we're up here, versus say if you go down into a gully or a draw or thing, you might want to divide that into the upland. then the side slope, and then the bottomland. And those might be your areas in which you take your sample from. Besides the landscape, are there differences in soil texture? Do you know that you have a sandy spot over in the middle of that? There's one of two things. If it's big enough, sample it separately. If it's not big enough, avoid it when you take that sample for that area. Another thing to look at for differences is plant communities. We know from our soil mapping experiences that you can delineate different soils based on the mix of the plants and the type of plants that are there. Finally, there's mankind or man-made differences. If you've got a field or a pasture or a field that you've put back into pasture, if there's an old fence line through the middle of it, it might have been treated differently, and you will get a different soil test from each one of those fields. One important thing when taking these samples is you've got to be consistent with your depth. A lot of our soils in Minnesota, as you go deeper in them, the pH changes in them, the phosphorus changes in them, the potassium changes in them. So you need to be consistent with your depth. So let's just take a few cores here. What I usually do, I like to use a probe. You scratch off the duff layer on the surface. You put the probe down on the ground, and when it's dry, you have trouble getting it deep enough. At the time of this YouTube, we're in the dry August, and it's a little tougher. So you pull it in, you can see I only got about 3 inches in that. You would discard that probe because it's not the depth you want. So you get, this one's a little taller or a little deeper than the 6 inches. So you kind of adjust it, core goes in the bucket. When you sample this area, then you want to do a random pattern. Being from Minnesota, we'd like that to be in the shape of an M. Let's say we've gone out, we've got our 20 cores. All right, our 20 cores. Got them in the bucket. Then you take and you mix it up really good. You mix it up really good. If you've got some plants in there, you might want to throw those out of the sample because they'll bias the organic matter analysis. So you get it mixed up real good. Take one of your bags. Open it up. Be sure, before you put the sample in, be sure, write your name, your address on it, some kind of sample ID so you know where it came from, okay? Then you just pour it in the bag. You only fill the bag to the line that's marked. Once you've done that, roll it up, and then you need to get ready to send it to the soil testing laboratory. When you have a sample, you have to fill out the sheet as I talked about earlier. And that's basically all you need to do at this time for a soil sample. So we talked about using a shovel as an alternative, but really a probe is probably your best bet to get the best sample. Now, where do you find these things? Possibility one is your county extension office may have a probe that they would lend to you. You may find it at farm supply stores. Some of the forestry supply services may have one that you could buy, so maybe a group of you could get together and buy one and loan it around. Take good care of it. It'll last a long time. In summary of what we've talked about today, there are probably 3 important points that I want you to take from this. And first one is when we do soil sampling, we want you to get a very good representative sample of the area. That means dividing it up correctly so you have similar soils together in the sample and getting the proper number of samples to represent that patch. The other thing that helps you with taking a good soil sample is to have the proper equipment. And so that includes, if you can find a probe, that's best. Using a plastic bucket helps a lot. If it's sticky in the soil, having something like WD-40 or some kind of silicone spray will work very well. And then finally, if you get this sample, you want to send it to a quality soil testing laboratory. And University of Minnesota has a very good soil testing lab. We have several others in the state that are very qualified too.